Freedom to the Slave. Very short questions and answers about the poem in general. In Freedom to the Slave. Very short questions and answers about the poem in general, you get 4 very short questions and answers. 1. What does Derozio refer to as slave in the poem Freedom to the Slave? Answer. Literally, a slave is a human being who is forced by his master to work under him. However, the mention of the patriot and the tyrant brings to mind the fact that India may be looked upon as slave. Actually, the poem was composed in 1827 when India was under the British regime. 2. What is the epigraph of the poem Freedom to the Slave? Answer. The epigraph of the poem Freedom to the Slave is a quotation from Campbell's The Pleasures of Hope. It is, as the slave departs, the man returns. It implies that the true spirit of life cannot be enjoyed by one in bondage. This idea is related to the theme of Derozio's poem, which poetizes the feelings of a liberated slave. 3. What is the meaning of the epigraph of the poem Freedom to the Slave? Answer. The epigraph of the poem Freedom to the Slave, which is a quotation from Campbell, conveys the idea that the true spirit of life cannot be enjoyed by one in bondage. This idea is related to the theme of Derozio's poem, which poetizes the feelings of a slave when he is liberated. 4. How does Derozio present freedom? The poem Freedom to the Slave. Answer. In the first stanza of the poem Freedom to the Slave, freedom is depicted as a physical existence, liberation from bondage. It is looked upon in terms of its effect upon the slave. In the second stanza, freedom is depicted as something which inspires a patriot and a generous man to perform selfless acts. Freedom to the Slave. Very short questions and answers from stanza 1. In Freedom to the Slave. Very short questions and answers from stanza 1, you get 7 very short questions and answers. 1. What effect did freedom have upon the heart of the slave? Answer. Freedom had a deep effect on the heart of the slave. To be precise, as he was alive, his heart was beating, but freedom added a sense of pride to this biological heartbeat. Actually, he felt proud to get back his original existence, the existence of a liberated human being. 2. How did freedom affect the soul of the slave? Answer. Freedom affected the soul of the slave to a great extent. In the time of bondage, the soul of the slave could not conceive of noble thoughts, but with the attainment of freedom, the slave could once again conceive of noble thoughts. After all, conceiving noble thoughts were useless in the period of bondage. 3. How did the slave become a man again? Answer. In the time of bondage, the slave did not have any liberty. In fact, he had to kneel before his master. Moreover, he did not have mental freedom. To be precise, he could not conceive of noble thoughts because there was no need for these. Naturally, having got back both, the slave became a man again. 4. How did the freedom of the slave cause difference to the breath of heaven? Answer. The breath of heaven, being part of nature, blew unaltered during the bondage of the slave as well as in the phase of his post-liberation. However, after the attainment of freedom, the slave felt as if the breath of heaven was giving him a sensation of freshness. Such a perception is, however, devoid of any logic. 5. Why did the slave smile exultingly? Answer. The slave smiled exultingly because he was happy at his recently achieved freedom. When the slave smiled in this manner, he saw wild birds flying. It perhaps suggests that he found a similarity between his state of freedom and that of the wild birds, and this finding prompted such a kind of smile. 6. What did the slave look at the running stream? Answer. A stream which is constituted of water runs smoothly and above all freely. Similarly, the slave who has got freedom from the master moves freely. The slave found an objective correlative in this running stream. Therefore, partly out of joy and partly out of wonder, the slave looked at the running stream. 7. I'm as free as they. With whom does the slave compare himself and why? Answer. The slave compares himself to winds, birds and floods. Winds flow unobstructed because it has enough power. Birds have the liberty to move freely because they have wings. Floods have powerful currents of water to glide unobstructed. Similarly, the slave has gained freedom and so he has freedom of mobility. So the slave says so. Freedom to the Slave Very Short Questions and Answers from Stanza 2. In Freedom to the Slave Very Short Questions and Answers from Stanza 1, you get 4 very short questions and answers. 1. What according to Derozio is the everlasting flame? Answer. According to Derozio, the everlasting flame is the noble ideals which are eternal in nature. These noble ideals can be conceived by only a free man. One finds such noble ideals in the slave after he is liberated from bondage by the master. Moreover, these ideals are suggestive of the broadness of mind. 2. How does the slave attain freedom? Answer. A generous man feels for the physical and psychological degeneration of the slave. Therefore, this person fights against the tyrant who has captivated the slave. The generous person takes the risk of life in the process and ultimately defeats the tyrant. Thus, through the sincere efforts of the generous person, the slave attains freedom. 3. Why does Derozio say, bleeds nobody to be free? Answer. The person who attains freedom and the person responsible for the said freedom are different persons. In Derozio's poem, slave attains freedom, but the person responsible for it is the generous man. This generous man bleeds by fighting with the tyrant who has made the slave captive. Thus, the said fighting is basically a selfless work. 4. What, according to Derozio, are the qualities of a patriot? Answer. According to Derozio, a patriot must have certain qualities. First, he will have to feel for the degradation of a person or place. Secondly, he will have to fight against this degradation and thus be above self-interest. Above all, he will have to think of his glory at the cost of life. Freedom to the Slave Very Short Question.